The music swirled around her, a waltz of silk and laughter, but Lady Cecily Ashford heard only the cold, careless voice of her husband cutting through the crystal and candlelight like a blade. She had been walking toward the terrace for a breath of air, fingers numb from holding a smile that no one looked at anyway. The ballroom of Ashford Hall glittered with lords and ladies who had long ago decided she was not worth noticing. She was the Duke's unwanted wife, a woman with a tarnished name and no allies. Tonight she had worn pale silver to disappear, and it had worked beautifully, until she heard Gareth speak. His voice drifted from behind a marble pillar, lazy and edged with the brandy he had been drinking since supper. He was talking to his cousin, Lord Drayton, a man with a laugh like broken glass. Cecily stopped, her heart suddenly still. "Your Duchess is looking rather tragic this evening," Drayton murmured. Gareth Ashford, Duke of Ashford, gave a low, humorless chuckle. "My wife. She is nothing but a duty I never wanted, a burden I carry because honor demanded it. She means less to me than the ash on my sleeve." The words landed silently, devastatingly, inside her chest. She did not gasp. She did not move. She simply stood there while the violins climbed into another cheerful refrain, and her entire marriage crumbled into cold, undeniable truth. A duty, a burden, ash on his sleeve. For an entire year she had waited. She had arranged his favorite flowers in the morning room. She had learned the names of every tenant on the estate, hoping to be useful. She had worn the colors he once mentioned liking, though that had been in passing before the wedding. She had written him small notes, never too emotional, just careful, hopeful little bridges that he never crossed. She had loved him quietly, completely, and now she understood that her love had landed on stone. The terrace doors stood open a few steps away. She walked through them, past the sheer curtains, into the cool night. Behind her the music faded. In front of her the garden stretched in moonlit silence. She did not weep. She simply placed one hand on the stone balustrade and let the cold seep into her palm, because something inside her had finally, irreversibly, stopped. That night she did not wait up for him. She went to her chamber, a room connected to his by a shared sitting room, and she closed the door that joined them. She had never closed it before. Not once. She had always left it slightly ajar, a silent, pitiful invitation. Tonight she latched it. The next morning she did not come down to breakfast. Gareth did not notice. He sat at the long mahogany table, scanning his correspondence, drinking black coffee, and the empty chair across from him was just an empty chair. No scent of lavender, no quiet good morning. His valet inquired if he needed anything. He said no. The morning passed. Cecily spent it walking the eastern path toward the village, a basket over her arm. She had no destination in mind except away. The air smelled of damp earth and early roses. For weeks now, she had been delivering small parcels to the poorer families on the estate, food, clean linen, simple medicines she had learned to prepare from an old herbal book in the library. It had been her only comfort, and she had told no one. Not because it was a secret, but because no one had ever asked. By midday she was in the cottage of the Miller family, helping young Tom Miller change the bandage on his hand. The boy had been injured at the mill, and the Duke's steward had done nothing. Cecily had found a clean salve and taught the family how to prevent infection. The Millers looked at her with startled gratitude. That look, the warmth of it, was more than she had received in Ashford Hall for months. She walked back slowly, her basket lighter, her shoulders steadier. She was a duke's daughter by birth, but her father had gambled away their fortune and died in disgrace before she was 17. The ton had shunned her, and only Gareth's sudden, shocking offer of marriage had saved her from living as a poor relation in a distant cousin's cold house. She had believed foolishly that his offer meant he saw something in her. Now she knew it was only duty, a noble man settling a debt that had never been hers. If she was a burden, she would be a quiet one. No more flowers, no more notes, no more waiting. Over the next fortnight, the rhythm of Ashford Hall shifted so subtly that the servants noticed before the Duke did. Cecily rose early and took her breakfast in the small morning parlor, a room Gareth never entered. She ate alone, watching the light move across the garden. She had begun a new project, cataloging the medicinal herbs she had found in the woodlands, and she spent hours sketching them in a leather-bound journal. She walked to the village nearly every day. At first, Gareth felt only a vague relief. The silence was easier. No soft footsteps following him, no careful questions about his day, no hopeful eyes meeting his across the dinner table. She had stopped waiting for him in the library each evening with a book in her lap and a question on her lips. She had stopped altogether. He told himself this was what he wanted. But one evening, about 10 days after the ball, he walked into the great hall and paused. The house felt different, colder. The fire in the main hearth had burned low. The flowers on the console table were wilted, their petals dropping onto the marble. His wife had always seen to the flowers. Now they were dying and no one else had noticed. He frowned, a splinter of irritation lodging under his skin. He found his housekeeper and said, "The flowers need replacing." Mrs. Hart looked at him with carefully concealed surprise. "Her Grace used to tend them, Your Grace. I shall see to it." Used to, the words clung to him. That night at dinner he sat alone at the long table, a single-place setting. No voice across from him, no quiet presence in the corner of his eye. He ate in silence and the food tasted like nothing. He remembered, suddenly and without wanting to, how she used to ask him about his day. He had always answered in monosyllables, never looking up. Now the silence was absolute and it pressed against his ears. He set down his fork. "Where is the Duchess?" The footman answered, "She dined early, Your Grace. She has retired to the West Study." The West Study was a small room at the far end of the house, practically forgotten. She had claimed it as her own a week ago. He had not visited it. He told himself he did not care. But that night he walked past it on his way to his chambers. The door was ajar and he caught a glimpse of her sitting by the window, candlelight catching the gold in her brown hair. She was writing in a journal, her brow furrowed in concentration. She looked content. She looked peaceful. She looked, for the first time, as though she did not need him at all. Something twisted in his chest. He walked on and did not name it. The first crack in Gareth's indifference came on an overcast Tuesday, when he rode out to inspect the southern farms and saw his wife standing in the village green with a man. The man was young, perhaps 30, with a kind face and a physician's leather bag. His name was Dr. Simon Pemberton, newly arrived to the district, and he was laughing at something Cecily had said. She was smiling too, a real smile, bright and unguarded, the sort of smile Gareth had never seen directed at himself. Her basket was full of clean linen, and she was showing the physician her herb journal. Their heads were bent together, easy as old friends. Gareth pulled his horse to a stop. His hands tightened on the reins. A hot, unfamiliar sensation rushed through him, something sharper than irritation, something that made his jaw clench. He watched as Pemberton touched her elbow lightly, guiding her toward the small apothecary shop. She went willingly, still talking, still smiling. He did not move for a full minute. The breeze carried the distant sound of her laughter, and it felt like a door slamming shut in his face. She had never laughed like that at Ashford Hall. She had never laughed like that at all, not with him. That evening he found himself waiting in the main drawing room, a glass of brandy untouched in his hand. He heard the front door open, heard her light footsteps in the hall. She came in, saw him, and paused. Her expression shifted, not with fear, but with a kind of guarded surprise, as though she had forgotten he might be there. "You were in the village," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Yes." She untied the ribbon of her bonnet. "I was helping Dr. Pemberton organize the new clinic." "Dr. Pemberton." The name tasted bitter. "You spend a great deal of time with him." Cecily looked at him steadily. "He is a good man. The villagers have needed proper medical attention for years. I am glad to assist." He wanted to say something cutting. He wanted to demand why she never looked at him with that easy warmth. But the words tangled in his throat because he knew the answer. He had killed that warmth himself, day by day, with cold silence and turned shoulders. She waited for a moment as if expecting more. When nothing came, she simply nodded and walked past him toward the west study. Her footsteps faded, and the room felt emptier than ever. A week later, Lady Priscilla Farrington held a garden luncheon at her nearby estate, and Cecily attended without Gareth. He had a meeting with his steward, and she had not asked him to accompany her. She dressed in a simple lavender gown, not the elaborate silks of her first months as Duchess, and carried herself with a quiet poise that had nothing to prove. She was pouring tea for an elderly dowager when Lady Priscilla's voice cut through the chatter like a silver knife. Of course, dear Cecily is so fortunate that Ashford took pity on her. Her father left her with nothing but debts and shame. A duchess by charity, one might say. Laughter rippled through the party, delicate and cruel. Cecily's hand did not tremble as she set down the teapot. She had learned to armor herself against words like these. But what stung, what cut deeper than the insult itself, was the memory of Gareth's voice that night at the ball. A duty I never wanted. She was nothing but charity, just as they said. She had no home except his tolerance. She looked up and saw Gareth standing at the edge of the lawn. He had arrived late, unannounced. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were on her. He had heard. She knew he had heard, and he said nothing. He simply stood there, tall and elegant and silent, while her humiliation hung in the air. Something inside Cecily went very cold. She smiled at Lady Priscilla, a smile that did not reach her eyes. I am indeed fortunate to serve the people of Ashford. The village clinic has helped 12 families this month alone. I find purpose far more sustaining than idle gossip. She turned and walked away, her lavender skirt brushing the grass. She did not look at Gareth. She did not wait for him. She walked all the way to the carriage, and when he eventually joined her for the ride home, the silence between them was a chasm neither crossed. That night Cecily unlocked the small trunk at the foot of her bed and began sorting through her things. Her mother's pearl brooch, a packet of pressed flowers, a miniature of her younger self painted before the scandal. She was not running away, not yet, but she needed to know she could. She needed a plan that did not depend on a man who saw her as Ash. She wrote a letter to her late mother's solicitor in Bath, inquiring about a small legacy her aunt had once mentioned. Enough perhaps for a cottage, enough to vanish. Gareth did not know it, but the ground beneath him had already started to shift. The next morning he came down to find her in the front hall, dressed for another walk to the village. This time he stepped in front of her. "Must you go every day?" Cecily paused, her bonnet ribbons trailing. "The clinic needs supplies. Dr. Pemberton and I are training 2 women from the parish to act as midwives." Pemberton again, he said, and the jealousy was there now, raw and unmistakable. "You find his company preferable to your own home." She looked at him, and for the first time there was no softness in her gaze, only a weary patience. "My home, your grace, has made it abundantly clear that I am not wanted there. I am merely finding a place where I am useful." He flinched. The title your grace from her lips had once been hesitant, a new bride learning formality. Now it was a barrier. "Cecily." But she had already stepped past him and out the door. He stood alone in the hall, the morning light pooling at his feet, and realized with a hollow ache that he could not remember the last time she had said his name. The days that followed were a slow torture he had not anticipated. Gareth began to watch her without meaning to. He saw her in the garden early, cutting herbs with steady hands. He saw her at the long table in the west study, writing furiously in her journal, letters and lists and notes he was not allowed to see. She ate her meals in the small parlor. She took tea in the village. She slipped in and out of the house like a ghost. And the staff, who had always respected her quiet kindness, now gravitated toward her warmth while the Duke remained in his study, alone with his ledgers and his growing restlessness. One afternoon he found her journal left open on a side table in the library. He knew he should not look. He looked anyway. The page was filled with neat sketches of plants and their medicinal properties, along with notes in her careful handwriting. Comfrey for inflammation, yarrow for fever, hawthorn for the heart. And then, at the bottom, a single line that stopped his breath. Perhaps a small cottage near Bath, something with a garden, a life of my own. A life of her own, without him. He closed the journal and set it down, his heart pounding. She was planning to leave, not in anger, not in a storm of tears, but quietly, logically, as one leaves an empty room. She was not asking for his permission. She was not waiting for him to change. She was simply going. That night he could not sleep. He walked the halls of Ashford Hall, past the closed door that connected their chambers, past the west study where her candle still burned, past the dying flowers in the console. The house felt like a mausoleum. He had built it himself, brick by brick, with every cold glance, every unanswered letter, every time he had looked through her instead of at her. He thought of the ball, the cruel words he had spoken to Drayton. He had said them because he was afraid. Afraid of the way she made him feel, afraid that she could never truly love a man like him, afraid that her quiet devotion was a mask for obligation. His mother, before she died, had warned him that Cecily's family was rotten, that the girl would use him for his title, and then discard him when a better prospect appeared. He had believed it, because it was easier to believe fear than to trust hope. But he had never asked Cecily. He had never once let her defend herself. He stopped in front of a locked drawer in his study. Inside was a leather pouch of letters his mother had given him the week before his wedding, supposed proof that Cecily was secretly engaged to a man in Italy, a man who would come for her once her family's debts were paid. Gareth had read them once, his heart splintering, and had never opened them again. That pain had become the foundation of his coldness. Now, with the memory of Cecily's tired eyes burning in his mind, he unlocked the drawer and pulled out the letters. He held them under the lamp. The handwriting was elegant, passionate, signed with the name Eduardo. But as Gareth looked closer, a detail he had missed in his jealous fury years ago became suddenly, glaringly obvious. The ink on the letters was crisp and black, while the paper was subtly aged with what looked like tea stains, artificially yellowed. And the wax seal, which he had assumed was foreign, was actually a cheap replica of his own family crest, but reversed. A forgery. His mother had forged these letters. She had despised the match, had wanted him to marry a woman with an unblemished name, and when he had refused, she had poisoned the well of his marriage before it could ever draw clean water. Gareth stared at the papers, his hands trembling. The truth was so ugly and so simple. He had spent a year punishing an innocent woman for a crime she never committed. He had turned their marriage into a desert because of a lie. And now she was slipping through his fingers, and he had no one to blame but himself. He buried his face in his hands, and for the first time since his mother's death, the Duke of Ashford wept. Cecily was in the west study, sealing a letter to the Bath solicitor when the door opened. Gareth stood on the threshold, his cravat loosened, his dark hair disheveled, his eyes red-rimmed and raw. He looked nothing like the composed, cold man she had married. He looked shattered. She set down her seal. "Is something wrong?" He crossed the room in 3 strides and dropped to his knees before her chair. The gesture was so unexpected, so utterly unlike him, that she instinctively drew back. "Forgive me," he said, his voice hoarse. "Forgive me, Cecily. I have been a blind, prideful fool." She stared at him. Her heart was a locked box. She could not open it so easily. "I do not understand." He held up the forged letters, his hands unsteady. "These were given to me before our wedding. I believed they were proof that you loved another man, that you were only marrying me for security. I let that falsehood rot inside me, and I turned it into cruelty toward you. I have been cold. I have been silent. I have been exactly the opposite of what a husband should be. And I am so sorry." Cecily took the papers. She read them slowly, her expression unreadable. Then she looked at him, and her voice was very quiet. "You believed these. You believed I would deceive you." "I was a coward," he said, his head bowed. I was terrified of loving you and losing you to someone else, so I chose to push you away first. It was monstrous. A long silence filled the room. Cecily's heart beat painfully in her chest. She thought of the cold meals, the unanswered notes, the way he had looked through her at the ball. A year of loneliness, a year of shame, and it had all been built on a lie. You let me believe I was nothing, she whispered. You let an entire household, an entire county, see me as an unwanted burden. You humiliated me in front of strangers. You let me stand alone while Lady Priscilla mocked my father's memory. And all the while, you held this secret instead of ever asking me the truth. He looked up, his eyes wet. I know, I have no defense. I only have the truth now and whatever is left of my heart if you will still hear it. She did not answer, she could not. The pain was too fresh, a wound that had only just stopped bleeding. She stood and walked to the window, her back to him, her arms wrapped around herself. The garden outside was peaceful, the roses blooming in soft pinks and whites. She had planted some of those roses herself, hoping he might notice. He never had. I was going to leave, she said, her voice steady. I have been making arrangements, a cottage in Bath, a quiet life. Behind her she heard him exhale as if struck. Please, he said, and the word was so raw, so unguarded that it nearly broke her resolve. Please do not go. I know I do not deserve you. I know I have been the architect of your unhappiness. But I will spend every remaining day of my life making it right if you will let me try. She turned then and looked at him, still kneeling on the carpet, the proud Duke of Ashford reduced to a man begging for a second chance. The sight stirred something deep in her chest, not forgiveness yet, but the first fragile thread of hope. I need time, she said. I need to know that this is real, not guilt or fear. I need to see the man you might become, not the man you have been. He nodded, his shoulders sagging with relief that she had not refused outright. I will wait. I will prove myself. I swear it. That night, Cecily did not close the door between their chambers. She left it slightly ajar, just an inch. Not an invitation, but a possibility. The weeks that followed were unlike any Cecily had known at Ashford Hall. Gareth did not crowd her. He did not make grand, theatrical gestures. Instead, he did small, steady things that spoke louder than ballroom declarations. He began appearing at the village clinic in the afternoons. Not to watch her, but to help. He carried boxes of bandages, repaired a leaking roof, sat with the elderly while she mixed tinctures. The villagers were astonished to see their stern duke with rolled-up sleeves and sawdust on his coat, but Gareth simply said, I am learning from my wife. Dr. Pemberton, who had initially been a source of jealousy, became a quiet ally. He saw the change in the Duke and remarked to Cecily one day, men who are truly lost rarely find their way back. Your husband has a compass now, and it points to you. Cecily said nothing, but she noticed. She noticed the way Gareth listened when she spoke, the way he remembered little details, her favorite tea, the name of Tom Miller's youngest sister, the exact spot in the garden where the morning light fell best. He brought her a new leather journal when her old one was full, and tucked a sprig of lavender between the pages because he knew she loved the scent. She received it with a quiet thank you, and later, alone in the West study, she pressed her fingers to the lavender and allowed herself to smile. One evening, he invited her to walk with him in the garden. The sun was setting, painting the sky in strokes of amber and rose. They walked in comfortable silence until he stopped by the rose bushes she had planted months ago, the ones he had never noticed. These are beautiful, he said. I planted them in March, she said softly. I hoped you might see them. His jaw tightened with regret. I see them now. I see everything now. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded paper. It was the record of a transaction, dated 2 years earlier, 6 months before he had proposed to her. A large sum of money paid to a notorious moneylender, settling the debts her father had left behind. The debtor's name had been erased, but the name of the benefactor was clear, Gareth Ashford. Cecily's hand flew to her mouth. You paid my father's debts before we were even betrothed. I knew your father's creditors were going to destroy you, Gareth said quietly. I could not bear to see you ruined. I had loved you from the first moment I saw you at a garden party in Wiltshire years ago. You were laughing at something a friend said and the sun was in your hair. I told myself then that I would protect you, even if you never knew my name. When your family's scandal broke, I arranged the marriage not out of duty, but because I wanted to save you. But then my mother's lies. He stopped, his voice cracking. I let fear corrupt the one good thing I had. Cecily stared at the paper, her eyes blurring with tears. All this time she had believed herself a burden, a charity case. But he had loved her in secret, long before she ever loved him. His distance had been a twisted, painful armor, not indifference. He had saved her from destitution, and she had never known. She looked up at him and the tears fell freely. You loved me even then. I have never stopped, he said, his voice breaking. I was too proud, too frightened, too foolish to show it. But I love you, Cecily. I love you with everything I have. The garden was silent except for the soft rustle of leaves. Cecily felt the last wall inside her crumble. She stepped forward and took his hand, cold and trembling in hers. I loved you too, she whispered. I loved you and you broke my heart. But I think if you are willing to help me mend it, we might make something beautiful from the pieces. Gareth pulled her gently into his arms and held her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. She felt his tears against her hair, and she wept too, not from sorrow anymore, but from the incredible, terrifying sweetness of forgiveness beginning to bloom. They stood together as the last light faded, and the roses, finally noticed, filled the air with their gentle, hopeful scent. A month later, the Duke and Duchess of Ashford hosted a gathering at the village green, not a ball for the gentry, but a fair for the entire parish. There were tables of food, a maypole for the children, and a long ribbon cutting in front of the new stone building that would serve as the permanent medical clinic, funded entirely by the Duke's private fortune and named in honor of his wife. Cecily stood beside Gareth, her hand resting in the crook of his arm, watching the villagers celebrate. Lady Priscilla was present, her smile tight and brittle, but no one paid her much attention. The Duchess had risen far above petty gossip. Before the crowd, Gareth raised his voice. I have a public apology to make, he said, and the chatter died down. For too long I failed my wife. I allowed her to be seen as less than she is, and I remained silent when I should have defended her with everything I had. Cecily Ashford is not a burden. She is the heart of Ashford, the gentlest, strongest soul I have ever known, and I will spend the rest of my life ensuring the whole world knows it. Cheering erupted. Cecily looked at him, her eyes shining, and he smiled down at her, a real smile, warm and unguarded, the kind she had once only dreamed of. Later, as the lanterns were lit and the music began, he led her onto the grass for a dance. It was not a polished waltz in a glittering ballroom, but an informal country dance surrounded by laughing villagers. Yet to Cecily, it was the most beautiful moment of her life. I love you, he murmured in her ear as they turned together. I know, she said, and her laugh was light and free. I love you too, my stubborn, foolish Duke. The music played on and the stars came out, and the story that had begun with a broken-hearted woman alone in a ballroom ended with a husband and wife who had learned that love, when tended with courage and humility, could heal almost any wound. The cottage in Bath was never mentioned again. Instead, Cecily's journal filled with new sketches, new plans for the clinic, and a single line she wrote on the first page of a fresh chapter. He called me a burden once, now I am his home.